You all here today for our talk, which we're very excited about. My name is Laura Wilkinson, and I'm the director of the Thomas Balch Library. And I hope that if you have not previously been to the library, you'll take some time after today's program to go upstairs and visit the actual reading room. We're a history and genealogy library that is open 7 days a week. We're open to the public, and people are most welcome to come anytime to enjoy the space, even if you don't have a research topic. We're always excited, though, to welcome historians such as Daniel, our speaker today, who have explored interesting topics. So Daniel Sieh is a living historian with more than 12 years of experience with various historical museums across the East Coast. He's worked for Colonial Williamsburg and at Claude Moore Historical Farm, and he graduated with a history degree from the College of William and Mary, and with a history degree also from American University, a master's degree.
Yes.
But I'm very pleased to welcome Daniel and learn what he's going to tell us about today.
Thank you very much, everyone. Thank you for coming. It is a pleasure to be here today. If you cannot hear me, just let me know. I'm happy to project my voice or speak louder if needed. Likewise, I'm very casual here, very relaxed. If any questions, any comments, any insults want to throw at me real quick, just raise your hand. I'm happy to tackle them. So as Ms. Laura mentioned before, I graduated from the College of William and Mary. I worked in various museums before on the East Coast. And during that time, there was always a question of like, when you look at me, you definitely know I'm Asian. That's not an unknown, that's a young question here. And alongside that, people ask me, like, what can you tell me about the Asian experience here in North America in the 18th century? Because we all know most Asian people came to the United States in the 19th century with the railroads. But what about beforehand? And that was a very good question. I actually went around and asked other fellow historians if they knew the answer. And they quite frankly told me, I don't know. So that launched me onto a path where I started researching and digging deeper to see what can we find about the Asian presence in the United States in particular during the 18th century, between 1750 to about 1790, 1800. So just a little background before going to my findings so far is explaining the context and background in Asia at that time. The countries they're familiar with, like China, Korea, and Japan, are looking a little bit different in the 18th century. In Asia, primarily going to see the establishment of the Qing dynasty in China, basically, this huge blob over here as the central dominant power politically and economically in the area. You have Japan over here, basically under the Tokugawa shogunate, undergoing a period of civil war, instability, and then finally isolation, where they're not welcoming foreigners inside Japan. India is starting to be partitioned between the French, the English, and undergoing colonization by the British Empire in this time. And likewise, of a myriad of different kingdoms, different countries, all duking it out, and more or less, the Central Asia at that time. So numerous countries, numerous cultures, different religions, all weaving a complex tapestry. So when I talk about Asia, just keep in mind that there's a lot of complexity here and a lot of different peoples all living under this term of umbrella of Asians. And furthermore, they have to keep in mind that both the West, Europe, Western Europe and Asia at the time, Chinese, Koreans, Japanese, and Indians, and others were definitely aware of each other. And there was definitely cross-cultural interchange. Over here on the right, you see a watercolor or a painting of the Yongzheng Emperor in China, basically dating to the early 18th century, mid 18th century. And I want to highlight his rather questionable fashion choices here. He's adopting what basically is a Chinese interpretation of Western clothing. This is definitely a wig done in the King Charles style, the very curly hair, very common in the early 18th century in Europe. And yet here we see him in a Chinese watercolor doing a traditional Chinese motif of tiger hunting in Western or Western Chinese tradition of what Western clothing should look like. And alongside that, over here, this is a small detail of the tributary scroll. So imagine an official Chinese document instructing officials, bureaucrats, as well as the imperial family on what quote unquote are called tributaries. Foreign peoples who are supposed to come to China and pay tribute as part of this like large diplomatic courtship ritual to establish official commercial trade ties. And here we have what they are allegedly portraying what a typical English man and English woman should look like and behave. Alongside that, and particularly in the Chinese imperial court, we have a significant amount of influence of Italian missionaries coming in, introducing concepts such as gunpowder, European artillery, and also even architecture, to the point where in the Chinese summer palace complex, they're going to go ahead and incorporate a lot of European motifs and styles into their own buildings. Here we have what you call the Hanyangtang, which is a water clock fountain, as well as what you call a Western style mansion as part of this summer palace complex, incorporating a solid Western core of architecture here alongside Chinese flourishes on the roof. And in particular here, you have this magnificent water fountain, which is showing the 12 animals of the Chinese zodiac, basically. A perfect blend of Chinese and European architecture into one building. Unfortunately, we can no longer see it today. It was destroyed in the Second Opium War. So all you can see here are the modern day ruins, the very bottom right. Likewise, that's European influence is spreading across other countries in Asia at that time too, even though Japan is officially closed off to European influence under Tokugawa shogunate in the 16th century, all the way to the opening of Japan with the Imperial Expedition in the late 19th century. There's still areas where Europeans can come in and conduct trade. The Japanese are particularly interested in European firearms and their medical studies. They're going to call the study of Western medicine and other topics Rangaku, or Dutch studies, because the Dutch are one of the few authorized Europeans allowed it to Japan. And in particular, they're going to be primarily focused in Dejima Island, which is a small island within Nagasaki. And the same thing goes on to India as well. At this time, you have the French and British Empire starting to duke it out in India to see who is going to come to control the area. And you're going to see it start the growing influence of the English East India Company within India itself, and English officials coming to India and starting to establish control there, to the point where here we have an example of a European trader being portrayed in an Indian art format here. This is done in the Indian style, same motifs, perspective. And if you study Indian art, if you look at the motifs and the way that this gentleman is laid and presented in the painting itself, he's portrayed as basically the equivalent to Indian royalty. So here we have an Indian art format describing a foreign subject here as royalty. And just an example of how extensive this dialogue is happening, this is an example of the British East India Company trade routes in the 18th century. You see it's all coming from England and reaching all across the triangle trade, but also a significant portion coming in to Asia. And all of that is because of commerce. Why are people sailing across the ocean, undergoing basically a 1-year-long voyage? Why? Because they like money. I'm sure everybody here likes money as well. I like money as well too. And that's a great motivator. And alongside that, you're going to see primarily by, I guess, quantity and quality to the primary export going from China to the West is, of course, porcelain. Why? Because it's a ancillary trade to tea. Europeans, once they come across porcelain and tea, they become firmly ingrained in European culture as part of this Enlightenment ed culture as well. It becomes a symbol of status, able to participate in tea drinking. It becomes a key cultural element to the point where we can't imagine English culture without having your afternoon tea. And alongside this, the ceremonial aspect of tea drinking in Europe, you have your accessories too. Kind of like today, you have your Stanley cups. You must have it. Same thing with porcelain. You must have your porcelain teacups and teapots to go alongside that. Otherwise, you're not taking part in this culture. You're going to be considered poor or uneducated, and that's very unfashionable. Alongside that, it is not just one-sided. I actually just stumbled upon this book, The Establishment of the Old China Trade by Mr. Jonathan Goldstein. Excellent book, by the way, but hard to find. And he actually mentions that American ginseng, which is growing in the Appalachian Mountains, basically, is being exported all the way to China because the Chinese viewed it as incredibly potent and strong and with strong medicinal properties. And they're actually in 1774, 75, they're exporting about 80,000 pounds of American ginseng all the way to China. So definitely not insignificant there. Alongside that, Europeans are not just simply buying Chinese porcelain, they're reinterpreting it alongside their own lines. This is what you call a soft paste porcelain plate. It is made to look like the Chinese porcelain plate, but it's what you call soft paste porcelain because it is a copy of Chinese porcelain along English lines. Basically, it's made in the Bow factory in England. If you look on the bottom here, you're going to see like Bow written on it. Because as we all know, Asian people love to just walk around with parasols and gaze upon vases. Typical behavior. And a little bit, shameless self-promotion there. A detail there, Bow. And in particular, too, this is my favorite instances that prove that things really haven't changed all that much. Alongside your Chinese porcelain, you're going to actually go have, your, porcelain sets for, dinners, and you always want to show off to your guests with your best foot forward. And part of that is having your custom family crest painted onto your, family dinner set. What a wonderful way to show off the history of your family with, fantastic, porcelain sets and saying like, look at me. I have custom sets made just for my family. Do you have a set? Didn't think so. Unfortunately, alongside that, the way that you put your order is you actually send a order describing your family crest with a drawing or maybe some, color palettes through an agent. It's going to take it all the way to China. It's going to work with middlemen in China to get it custom made by these craftsmen in China who have never seen Western heraldry. Unfortunately, they're going to take notes on what the drawing is. It's with the labels, red, blue, and green, and they're going to transcribe it one-to-one onto the plate. So it's supposed to look like this, and here we have the labeling, red, over there, into the drawing itself. So once again, showing that when you order something online, things never quite come out the same as you expected. Wish.com is historical. And likewise, we saw the Western mansions done in China as well. Same thing happens in Europe. They're going to incorporate Asian elements into their own architecture as well, interior decorations. There's a Newsom house in Leeds, beautiful Western mansion over here in England, as English as they come. And yet here we have center figure, a Chinese paper lantern, as well as Chinese porcelain sets, decorations, and lacquered cabinets. Same thing here as well. The wallpaper is Newsom house as well. And it's actually, this one is particularly interesting and yet horrifying for one reason. The wallpaper is Chinese, but the birds come from the Birds of America book by James Audubon, which is one of those textbook examples of, great literature and great example of mature culture in Europe. And yet Miss Newsom here purposely cut out the birds and placed them on top of the wallpaper to make it a bit more exciting. So yes, interesting. It's great. Western and Asian influences combined in a horrifying fashion. And also goes into textiles too. We saw the Yangtze Emperor dressed in European fashion, and also we're going to see Westerners importing Asian textiles into their own clothing. This is a waistcoat made of Chinese red damask silk over here, purposely made into a Western style waistcoat that wouldn't look out of place anywhere in colonial streets in North America. Same thing goes for women's dressing. This is Indian printed cotton. India is a renowned producer of cotton in the 18th century. If you go to this day today, you're going to see fantastic examples of cotton today that's hand blocked, hand printed. Beautiful textiles, and they're being imported all the way to, as far away as Williamsburg, Virginia, which is the capital of Virginia, to make beautiful dresses. And I want to make it clear, just because you're part of the lower classes, a working person, doesn't mean you don't have access to this vast network of trade in the 18th century. One of the most common examples of an exported good, coming from Asia to North America is going to be these printed neckerchiefs that you see sailors, workmen, all across wearing, and all these paintings are all reflected, and they're all coming from India, all the way to here in North America. So just because you're in a lower social class doesn't mean you can't show off here and there. We all know that person that is perpetually broke, and yet They insist on having that Gucci belt. They may not be able to afford the whole Gucci suit, but at least one small item. And Westerners are also really, creative. That's an example of what you call a Qing Dynasty court suit, basically. It comes as a robe and is a part of the official uniform of the imperial court. Only few people should have access to that. That is official state uniform. And yet, here we have an example of something that was probably smuggled out of Asia and reinterpreted from a Chinese-style robe into a European-style banyan, which is in itself a reinterpretation of an Indian robe into Western fashion, something you can wear around the house. Casual wear is basically your bathrobe. They just, something casual, comfortable around the house. And this is what it should look like originally. And you can see that from official wear to Western interpretation, there's definitely a difference. But here we have multiple cultures involved, Indian robe transforming to Western clothes, and then Chinese clothes reinterpreted along those lenses. Furniture as well. I don't want to spend too much time, but here we have examples of, furniture, like bamboo is not really seen in chairs of this style, not really seen in Asia too much. But here we have Europeans incorporating faux bamboo elements into their own furnishings. Lacquer work, which they call Japanning, because they're primarily seen in Japan, this kind of black lacquer with the pearl inlays, very popular here in the United States, and they're going to see them imported from Japan and China all the way to Boston, all the way to the Charleston area, North Carolina, South Carolina, and so forth. And they're actually going to kind of try to copy that themselves with the same motifs, all done on an American line as well. This is an example of a high chest made in Boston, made to look like an Asian style lacquered furniture set. But, things and objects are all fine and dandy, but what about people? And primarily along these trade routes, Asian people will indeed come to North America, not in the same amounts that we see in the later 19th century, but still present here. And I think that adds a lot of nuance and significance to the discussion. Unfortunately, I think I'm missing one illustration here in the middle, but this slide is going to just summarize a little bit what we see here. When Asians come to North America, I think they can be divided into three major categories. The first one is what you call the honored guests, is when Asian people come here very intentionally and through official channels, and usually from a higher social income bracket as well, or practicing a very unique or skilled craft. They usually receive very well in Western circles. They actually make quite the splash, and they leave a lot of historical artifacts behind just because they're deemed very important, very significant. So they're usually much better documented than most people. Towards the middle of the bracket, we have what I call the sailor. And they're probably equivalent to what you call the middle class Asian visitor to the United States. They're not, or to Europe for that matter as well. They're not quite wealthy, but they're practicing a skilled trade that deems them at least worthy of some measure of respect in Western circles, but there is more underlying friction in there. And finally, we have the final category, what I call the servant. These people are usually from a lower social bracket that are being brought over to Western Europe and North America, sometimes against their will, usually as enslaved servants. And based on the language that we see in the documentation left behind, that there's not much, that they're treated in the same social class as enslaved African Americans. The language used is about the same, but they make a point to make them distinct from African Americans. So same social class, yet ethnically distinct. So let's start with the honored guest first. I think the first one, the image you saw here is Mr. Chitwa. He's going to be one of the most documented people we have of Asian people in England at the time in particular. He actually leaves several paintings behind because he causes such a splash at the time. He's going to be a figurine maker. He works with porcelain, and he visits England around 1770 and 1771. When he arrives in England, starts to advertise his service as an artist, and the local art scene in London goes wild over him. Mr. Mortimer here is one of the finest painters of the 18th century. He makes a portrait of him. And alongside artist circles, he's regarded as an honored guest as a fellow artist of equivalent skill, and he's wine and dined by high society, by everyone he meets. And this is a great example of this. This is a painting by Johann Joseph Zoffany. He's one of the finest artists of the 18th century in England. A lot of paintings done of famous people, nobles, are all done by him. And this is a painting of all the people of the Royal Academy of Arts at the time. It's a who's who of artists of the 18th century. You have Paul Stanley, you have Mortimer, and a Hamilton there. And on the bottom left, you're going to see a guy kind of jutting on his head. And I want to bring up the detail here. Here we have Mr. Chitwa, featured a little bit haphazardly. That probably tells me that it's a little like a last minute addition. But still, that's him right there. He's considered such an equal artist that he is featured in one of the paintings of Who's Who. This is basically a snapshot of Hollywood Walk of Fame of who's the best artist in England at the time. Unfortunately, his return trip back to China was not as hassle-free as we probably would have hoped. Unfortunately for him, but also fortunate for us because it gives us a bit more color about his stay. This is an example from the Gentleman's Magazine, and it describes an incident on his return trip. Apparently, while he was going from the rowboat to his ship that would take him back to China, he's wearing his Chinese robes, and the crew of the ship is receiving him in a very hostile manner. They think that he's dressed kind of like a woman, and they think that even though he's a man, being dressed like a woman is bringing bad luck to a ship. And to corroborate their suspicions, he gets blown off board and he's rescued by the ship's pilot, basically. But the crew takes that as a very ill omen. They threaten to throw him overboard again, and this time for good, because they don't want to bring bad luck into their ship. Mr. Chikwa is understandably very scared about the situation, and he begs the ship's captain to take him back to the harbor. The ship's captain obliges him. He takes him back to the harbor, but you can imagine the scene, this soaking wet guy, funny looks, funny robes, and the townsfolk see him being looking kind of haphazard. So they think that the ship's captain, the ship's pilot taking him back to shore are basically kidnapping him. So they almost basically dogpile them and start beating them up. Fortunately, though, that's resolved. And then afterwards, we have a follow-up article for the Gentleman's Magazine saying that he does indeed hop on a next ship back to China next year, and he's this time dressed in the English way. So Western robes. Probably good for him. And we have also other evidence from other Chinese Asian visitors to England that, from a little bit earlier. We have basically the Chinese convert, basically an example of a Chinese missionary that's being converted to Catholicism, stopped by England on those way back to China, and as well as other traders who are on their way back and forth, following these trade routes, either getting, blown off course from their destination harbor of Lisbon here. This is Lum Kinhua. And basically the British sees this guy as a propaganda piece because apparently he made his way to Lisbon, and somehow in Lisbon, there's some sort of misunderstanding and he was left stranded there. And the British claimed that the Portuguese, being a conniving and vicious people, deprived him of his goods because they're Catholics. And the British, being good Protestants, decided to rescue him and send him back free of charge back to China. So there you go. Probably a case here that I want to highlight is the case of Mr. John Anthony, because yes, he's a Chinese visitor to England, but I think the circumstances behind his stay and the evidence surrounding him make him probably one of the most interesting cases to study. Because Mr. John Anthony is going to be serving as a liaison between the British East India Company and the number of sailors they hire to ply the trade routes between China and England. Number one, the fact that they tell that they're hiring a dedicated Chinese person just to serve as middle management between the company and these Chinese sailors tells us about something about the numbers present, that it's economical to actually hire a dedicated manager just for them. And on top of that, too, a lot of the documentation he leaves behind is either in the Old Bailey, which is their courthouse in London, but as well descriptions about what happens. There's a lot of tensioning happening in London at the time that these English sailors are blaming these Chinese sailors and Indian sailors coming over, being hired by the British East India Company as people who are stealing their jobs because the company gets to pay them less. So as you can see here, times really haven't changed all that much. The company, though, argues that they need to hire these Asian sailors because they're experienced, they know the trade routes, and they know the currents. They have local expert knowledge that makes them subject matter experts on these navigation routes. But beyond that, here, John Anthony, we don't know his native Chinese name. And I call him John Anthony because he's in England for so long that in the late 18th century, he's going to go ahead and apply for and be granted British citizenship. And that takes us to the sketch by George Dance over here. And to us, his haircut might seem odd in a little bit, but the significance behind that cannot be overstated. In China at that time, you're required to shave the front part of your hair and wear your hair in a long ponytail called a Manchukuo in English circles. It basically means that you're basically pledging your loyalty to the reigning Qing dynasty at that time. And basically, if you were to remove that queue for any reason, you'll be punished by death. The saying would be, keep the hair, keep the head. So the fact that this is John Anthony is going ahead and applying for British citizenship and basically adopting a Western haircut, we're getting rid of this Chinese, this Manchukuo, tells us his long-term plans. He doesn't intend to ever go back to China. And later on, here we have from the Gentleman's Magazine again, an account of his funeral. If you want to go ahead and read it, you definitely can. But basically, he is such a prominent figure in the Chinese community of London that every Chinese person in the area comes to pay their respects. And in this funeral procession, they're incorporating both Chinese and English elements to the funeral. The service is done in the Anglican fashion, but the procession itself incorporates a cortege of Chinese people dressed in white, which is the mourning color in Chinese culture. So here we have a Chinese British subject incorporating in his funeral an Anglican ceremony and yet Chinese customs. A great example of a fantastic person combining English customs with his Chinese heritage. Now, moving on to the sailors, because Mr. John Anthony dealt with sailors all his life. And these sailors are going to be vital to keep these trade routes that we talked earlier flowing. And unfortunately, because of their status as working class people, we don't have as much physical evidence as I would like. Because number one, these people are foreigners. If they're going to be literate, they'll be written in their native dialects. And as such, they're probably either destroyed, lost, or lying somewhere untranslated for us to document or research. Thankfully, though, we still have some evidence here and there offering tantalizing glimpses into their lives. Here we have one of the most interesting tombstones you're going to find in Boston. This is over here of a gentleman called Chow Mandarin, which is an interesting name to be sure. It's like calling somebody Tony Italian, but it fits. And here it's really hard to make out what's written, so that's why I transcribed it here. Here lies interred the body of Chow Mandarin, a native of China, aged 19 years, whose death was occasioned on the 11th of September, 1798, by a fall from the mast of the ship Mac of Boston. The stone erected to his memory by his affectionate master, John Boyd Jr. So unfortunately, it looks like Mr. Chow Mandarin met his untimely end quite young and because of an accident, because he fell from the mast of the ship. A true tragedy, but good for us because at least it gives us more documentation about his life and his story and about the presence of Asians in North America. Here we have one of these sailors plying the routes, and it offers documentation and proof that yes, just because they're hired by the British East India Company doesn't mean they're stuck in London. They're plying the trade routes all the way between England and North America. They can be documented here, even after the revolution itself. Yes, ma'am.
I was going to ask, are you with John Boyd?
John Boyd Jr., I haven't done as much research into him as I wish because the most of the documentation is in Boston, and it's just a matter of going there and trying to see if I can dig it up. But from what we can tell, his master John Boy Jr. is going to be the captain of the ship. And basically, he felt so bad about the incident that he decided to buy a tombstone and a gravesite to him. If you ever go to the Central Burying Ground in Boston, you can find this tombstone, and that's my photo right there. Basically, I walked over there to the Central Burying Grounds, and a bunch of the people, the workers there, keeping this, the graveyard kept. They just saw me freaking out over this tombstone. They're like, is he okay?" Oh, it's an absolutely amazing document. So when one of the workers walked up to me, he's like, "You okay, sir?" I'm like, "Yeah, yes, trust me." I'm like, "It's okay. It's great. It's a happy dance." Unfortunately, it looks like the downloading feature, we lost the sketch over here, but it's okay. Basically, it's a watercolor from Mr. Gabriel Bray. He's going to be a lieutenant in one of these ships of the Royal Navy. And it just showcases what you call an Oriental seaman. I put the Oriental under question mark because the Oriental part was added in the labeling section of the document much later in the 19th century. But it showcases what looks like a Chinese sailor putting his leg behind his head as a kind of a parlor trick of one of the ships, I think HMS Hermione, plying the triangle trade and keeping an eye out for smuggling in the Africa coast.
Since the picture's not there, can you show us how it looks?
Huh? Oh, yes, unfortunately, no, I'm not that flexible quite yet. No, this is a lecture, not a demonstration. And finally, we have the third category, what are called the servants. So when I talk about the servants, these people are usually of a lower social class and then being brought over to England and North America, oftentimes against their will. This is a illustration by Paul Sanby of a servant to the Duke of Cumberland here. And this is probably showing what you call an Indian servant, probably from Southeast Asia at the time, probably from Bangladesh or Southern India, just based on his looks and about his dress. And just a point of note over here, you can see that his wearing a turban is probably unlike anything you probably see in India along the time. And it's probably what you call basically chinoiserie Japonismo, or basically a reinterpretation of Indian customs or Indian dress alongside a English lens, just to make it more palatable, but to keep the element of exoticism. Because at that time, having an exotic servant was considered very prestigious and emphasized how cultural and how educated you were, that you have access to such a variety of different goods, including your servants. Here you have Mr. Huang Tong. It's going to be at Knoll Hall. It's a painting by Sir Joshua Reynolds. If you go over there today. And this is an example of chinoiserie in its prop in like almost living form. Mr. Huang Tong is about 1920 when he comes to England and around 1775. And he's going to be serving as basically a page, a lower rank servant within his household. And being so young, it's very unlikely for him to even be dressed in such a fashion because the robes and the hat are all part of what you call imperial uniform, basically. Only an imperial court bureaucrat, the Qing dynasty, should be allowed to wear such robes and hats. And here we have this kid basically dressed up in that fashion. So it tells me that probably the gentleman that owned Knoll Hall at the time, the third Duke of Dorset, John Sackville, dressed him to make him look even more exotic. And we kind of see probably because they're closer to what he wore in his day-to-day in this unpublished sketch. I apologize for the resolution, it's not very high. But here we have Mr. Huang Yutong over here. He's probably dressed in Western clothes, wearing breeches, coat, and jacket, but he's keeping that hat just as a way to kind of emphasize how exotic he looks, kind of reinforcing how fashionable his servants are. And in the same way, this runaway ad is probably going to be the extended documentation going forward. Being enslaved people usually, or servants, they don't tend to leave a lot of written records behind, or the evidence circumstanting their existence is often kind of tangential. You often only see them through these fingerprints of cross-historical record, and most of them come in these runaway ads. Runaway ads are just ads that a gentleman or people can put in the newspaper advertising the escape of either runaway enslaved people or runaway servants. And furthermore, this kind of helps emphasize another aspect of why research to them is so difficult. Usually when they come to Europe or North America, their names are anglicized. In this case, we have a gentleman here called Caesar. We don't know his original name, But here we have his Western name, Caesar, and with a small reference to where he comes from. Usually at the time, the 15th century, they're referring to Asians by the term East Indian. That is opposed to West Indian, West Indies being the Caribbean at the time, East India being Asia at the time. Unfortunately, it makes no distinction of what part of Asia he comes from. East India is just a very catch-all term. It could be China, it could be Korea, it could be Bangladesh, it could be Southeast Asia, it could be Indonesia. We just don't know. So unless we can find other stuff to kind of point us in the right direction, we just know that they're Asian, and just based on his physical description, we can make a good guess that being brown skin and black hair, he's probably from Southeast Asia. Unfortunately, because we don't have his name or about more details about his life, we don't know exactly from where. But basically, based on this, we know that he is somewhere in Scotland and serving a gentleman called Sir Hector Munro. And thankfully, we're privileged to know that there is a portrait of Sir Hector Munro. And in that portrait, we probably have maybe a small inkling of maybe what Mr. Caesar looked like. If you look at the background, you can see him. Doesn't look very white to me, but based on his, slant eyes, his dark skin and black hair, probably that could have been him. Could have been somebody else, of course, but it offers us a clue. And that kind of also, this presence of being an enslaved servant here translates to North America. Most of my evidence primarily comes from the newspaper Virginia Gazette, which is very predominant here in the Williamsburg area. Big thank you to Colonial Williamsburg for offering a lot of this documentation to me and doing the effort of scanning it for me as well. And a lot of them are going to be labeled as East Indian, and they're going to be in the Williamsburg area. And some of them are all going to be in this area of Virginia, Southern Virginia at the time, because most of them are operating off harbors. And what's next to Williamsburg? You have Norfolk, which is one of the major harbors for the export of tobacco in the 18th century. And as you can see here, all the language, runaway, East Indian, giving their physical descriptions alongside just their names, all anglicized. The way that they're referred to in all these runaway ads parallels almost one-to-one how African Americans who are enslaved who run away are all labeled. That tells us that their status is about similar, and yet through all the descriptions, they make a point to make sure that they are listed as East Indian. So that tells us that they're of a similar social status and yet ethically distinct. And then thanks to the work of Mr. Justin Clement, we have an example of at least one documented certified East Indian or Asian person serving the revolution. This gentleman is called Charles Peters. He's going to be brought over to North Carolina as an enslaved servant, and he employs what we call in legal terms a master stroke. So even though he's enslaved, his master is going to be a Carolinian Tory or a loyalist. So when the revolution kicks off, he proceeds to go ahead and sue his master. Because at that time, the revolution, there's an argument going on that all loyalists should have their property confiscated. And since he's enslaved, he is property. And as such, he should be confiscated from his master. And since he's confiscated property, he should be allowed to be used in the service of the revolution and the Continental Congress. And thus, he should be allowed to join the Continental Army. So when the lawsuit goes to the county level comes back to him and tells him, no way, get lost. He appeals, and it goes to the state level court. And the North Carolina actually agrees with him. So he is confiscated from his master and set free. And then he joins one of the North Carolina regiments in the Revolution. We actually have a bit of his service record. He goes on to serve in Monmouth, Valley Forge, and eventually the Siege of Charleston, North Carolina. That's rather unfortunate because the Siege of Charleston, North Carolina is a disaster. Almost all American forces there are captured. His trail after that goes a little bit cold. Mr. Justin Clement has done excellent research, and he has suspicions that we find him again serving as a POW in a loyalist unit in Barbados, where he unfortunately is murdered there. Unfortunately, we have a lot of trouble doing international research. Barbados is very sensitive about their documentation that they're not willing to share with that. So until I can go to Barbados, I promise for historical research, I might have to sit in the back burner for a little bit. And I want to highlight this gentleman here because this is of a gentleman called John Newton, and it's going to be running away from his master from the Williamsburg area, and also Asiatic Indian, so very clearly Asian. And I want to bring this out because he runs away around early July 1776. And we all know that something very special is happening in early July 1776. A minor disagreement between the colony and the mother country is resulting in some major shooting happening. Some minor case of violence, don't worry about it. It's gonna go blow over. And yet here we have Mr. John Newton going from England, passing through several masters, ending up in the United States. And all of that during the revolution, the beginnings, violence has already erupted in England. Boston is under siege. And now this gentleman runs away. I know this is not being very academic on my part, but I like to think a little bit from his perspective. You're being brought over halfway around the world to England and now to another foreign land, even more distant than before. You're in an exotic place, surrounded by people you don't know. And now there's discussion about freedom, independence, definition of we the people. And here we might have some inklings about his first step into what the definition of we the people might mean. This gentleman having taken some agency into his own hands and go ahead and running away. And now how he runs away might be a little bit interesting. He basically says the runaway ad basically describes the gentleman riding behind his master on a spare horse. He's telling that his master, the spare horse, is tired. He'll catch up with him later. Don't worry about it. He never returns. Don't worry, man, I'll catch up with you, don't worry. And yet here we have an example of an Asian person in North America, far away, perhaps taking what independence means into his own hands. And that is to say, based on all of the evidence, I cannot put a hard number of how many Asian people were in North America at that time. Perhaps we'll never know. But they were there. They were present. And I think just having at least a little bit of the answer there, maybe not the whole truth, maybe that's enough for now. Maybe that's a good start. And in today's age, where we're revisiting the revolution for the 250th anniversary, when we're revisiting the discussion of what it means to be we the people, I think that warrants merit. I think that's merit. It's worth to bring to discussion. Because I would argue the United States is not a perfect country. Never was, but it can be. And that is part of the American experiment. And it's about remembering why we declared independence 250 years ago. It's an ever-evolving experiment. And while the definition of we the people has changed throughout time, I think there are underlying stories that struggle for independence, about the affirmation of our basic rights, about the pursuit of happiness, has not changed. Thank you. All right, I'm happy to answer any and all questions here. Yes, sir.
All of the runaway ads that you show specifically label people as either East Asian or Asiatic. And I'm just curious, do you think that was always the case, or potentially could there have been other people that were just labeled as slaves that were never labeled as anything else? Like, it might be just.
Oh, absolutely, sir. That is a huge problem that I have, because unless we have the East Indian or the Asiatic term associated with it, these people just blend into the historical record. Like one of the great examples is Mr. Wong Yitong. As soon as he arrives to England, his servant name becomes Warrington. So unless you know that he's Chinese, you really have no background on who he is. And just, they kind of get lost in translation, basically. Actually, there's another great example. There's a runaway ad in Perth Amboy, New Jersey, of a gentleman that basically a jailer in Perth Amboy that catches what he thinks is a runaway servant of a young boy called Thomas Ganges, basically. And he's describing him as dark skin, smooth black hair, And in the runaway ad, he actually describes them as like, he's clearly not white, he's clearly not black either. He says he's Indian, but I'm not sure what that means. So there you go. There's a lot of room for ambiguity here. But even at the time, people didn't quite know where to place him, basically. But great question. Thank you.
Well, I was doing research on Mexico, colonial Mexico, and I didn't realize there were so many Asians who came over as slaves.
Yes, they're being usually brought as enslaved people, and there's actually a little out of the scope of my research, but there's actually a letter written by the imperial court in China to Portugal, basically telling them like, please guys, stop enslaving our people. Like this is not cool. Like please stop.
So you're not being sold by China, they're being kidnapped and sold into slavery?
That's a bit of a gray zone. Yeah, that's a great question. So as far as I can tell, and I'm not specialized in this too much, but basically they're being either sold by the bureaucrats in the local region or local district and then sold to these traders, either on the gray market, not usually legally by the imperial court itself, but in this really nebulous zone where nobody quite knows if it's legal. It's this one county clerk doing it, but maybe not the guy in the area, or this guy's a debtor and the criminal, a criminal caught him and is like, you know what, maybe they could get some money off him, somehow, and doing it through that.
Okay, in China, I was reading the 19th century, they allowed Europeans to trade, but they're only allowed to be in certain areas.
Yes, that's what's called the canton system.
Yeah.
And that started around 1750, 1770. It becomes really more officialized and formalized around 1800s, 1820s. The heyday of that comes right before the first Opium War, and after that is basically that massively expand because the imperial central government in China is basically collapsed at this point. The central government is very weak because they're dealing with what you call the Taiping Rebellion, just minor rebellion that kills 20 million people. So minor. And the central government is collapsing basically. Massive famine, starvation, disease. It's not a good time to be in China. That's why a lot of Chinese people are actually leaving China at the time to go to California. You don't want to be there at that time, trust me. Ma'am, you had it, but yes.
Just wondering if you had, I know you're focused a lot on Virginia, but did you do any other research like in other ports like Philadelphia or New York?
Yes.
I know you have a Boston example, but.
Also in Maryland too, and Roanoke County of all places too.
Oh.
Found one from there over here. Boston, I saw one or two in Philadelphia. There's actually an original that's for about a gentleman, a Dutch trader settles in Philadelphia. It came from this book over here, and I'm doing more research now. That's why I was like, oh gosh, when I have a position tomorrow and I find this now, like, yeah, never ending. Apparently, this Dutch trader settled in Philadelphia, and he actually brought a whole Chinese room into his house, basically. And alongside that, he had actually 8 to 10 Chinese servants. So research is ongoing, but I think that actually might be more evidence of other Chinese people in North America, even. So there you go. Yes, ma'am.
I was wondering when you're moving around to different museums like Philadelphia, Williamsburg, do you have people come up and say, I think I had a great grandfather in the Revolutionary War? I mean, I know there's this big break, 1882, where the stopping of Asians coming into the United States. So there's this gap, but I didn't know if any oral history might exist there.
I never had somebody come to me personally from an Asian perspective telling me like, oh yes, I think my grandfather was there. We have oral anecdotes of Filipino sailors being employed by the Continental Navy. Unfortunately, I hadn't a chance to scope that out further, but we do have another evidence of definitely Asian sailors being present. There's the Chinese American History Museum in DC dug out a fantastic little journal entry of a ship log from 1786 of 3 Chinese sailors who wrote their name in Chinese characters on the ship roster, basically, because they're left stranded. Basically, the background behind that means that these 3 Chinese sailors came over to Baltimore, being promised that if they worked the way into Baltimore, they'll be given return trip back or work trip back to China. And basically the captain just says, you know what? I lied about the second part. You're stuck here now, Baltimore. Bye, and leaves. So they're left stranded in Baltimore, which is, I would argue, a fate worse than death. Sorry, I'm having a very dry sense of humor. I think so. I haven't read Moby Dick in years, ever since I left school. But yeah.
I noticed in this ad, it's a life. Did you find any records of women?
I have no solid evidence of women, but like it's circumstantial at best right now. This is an example of George Clive and his family. Basically, George Clive is one of the main people in charge of the British trade in India at the time. And we have the painting of him and his family. And guess who's taking center stage here? Exactly, an Indian female servant here. Unfortunately, I'm trying to dig more information on who the Cliftons were, and I think their records were all in England at the time, so I have to do another work trip to England just so I can research that. But that could be artistic, it could be just a nod to the fact that most of their fortune comes from India. But it could also really be an Indian servant that they actually brought from India to England.
But they would be servants and not slaves.
That's a good question. I think there would be enslaved servants.
Kind of stuff.
They're kind of stuck. I don't think they're being held against that. I think they're being held against their will. As a great example of that is Mr. Caesar that we talked earlier. You don't run away from a contract that you voluntarily signed usually. Do you see what I mean?
Yes, I've seen like, when, spoke on the slavery, and some of the ads where he has to run away, so he talks about his indentured servants running away too. He wants them back, but they don't want to.
Well, a lot of that is because the masters are supposed to give their servant, the indentured servants, tools, certain amount of clothing per year, and a amount of money, and the servants take off when they aren't getting it. So there's two sides to that.
I also want to make a small detour to make sure that there's a difference between chattel slavery, as we discussed it in North America, as well as indentured servitude. Those are usually talked about in the same in usually pop history, but they're very distinct entities in historical records. Indentured servitude is a contractual obligation. Chattel slavery is not a contractual obligation because you're just owned by, you're treated as an object basically, and you have no rights, and the status transfers from parent to child. Indentured servitude does not.
And chattel slavery is outlawed in Britain, 1773, in Somerset.
Yes.
Case. Yeah. There were press gangs too, because the ships needed sailors, and so they were, and they would, it's like they were kidnapping the price, put you on a ship. I'm sure that they.
I'm so glad you brought that up because a friend of mine, I'm losing my mind here because he wrote an entire paper just on the distinction between press gangs and the discussion of that in English politics, basically. The English public sees it as like a violation of Englishman rights, basically, because they're being press ganged, because these are British subjects, they have rights, and yet you're basically kidnapping them and putting them in Royal Navy service. They think it's a violation of their rights as Englishmen, basically, which is very interesting. And yet they see it as a necessary evil sometimes. And the discussion is there for sure.
The gentleman who did the pottery and all that, who was beaten up,
Oh, yes.
he choose to wear the Chinese clothing, or did he think it was good business to wear it, you know what I mean, and not wear English clothing?
That's a good question. I found another a written record of his stay in England. Basically, a preacher decides to pay him a visit because he's such a sensation. He's like, oh my gosh, I can actually talk to an active Chinese person. This is amazing. And in his visit, he describes as actually wearing Chinese robes and Chinese clothing while inside his house. So I think that probably just tells us that's what he brought, that's what he's used to. So he's going to continue to dress in his fashion. The account described as being dressed as the fashion of his country, and that's the title of the presentation, after the fashion of his country. Yes, sir.
Are there any records of Chinese on the west coast? I see everything's pretty much on the east coast. Are they sailing or doing any sort of trade on the west coast with the Spanish?
Definitely Spanish for sure. I do know that, for example, if you go to Mexico City to this day, you're going to find Chinese porcelain being brought over because going from the China to the Pacific to Mexico is actually a whole lot easier than going from China all the way to the Atlantic to Europe at that time. The Spanish actually had a lot of contact with the Chinese, and that's why they're having so many silver mines in Potosi, which is in South America, is like a literal mountain of silver. They completely dug up an entire mountain just for the silver, because the Chinese will only trade in silver bullion, basically. And that silver trade is just to fund that massive trade between Spain and China at the time. There's also fantastic little historical flashpoints where you have the Spanish trying to conquer the Philippines and coming into conflict with Japanese Waco pirates, basically. And there's a battle where it happens where you have Japanese Waco pirates wielding katanas going against Spanish tercios, which are, Moro helmets, pikes, and muskets, basically conquistadors versus Japanese samurai. Whoa, it's like, there's also another,
Which one won?
oh, the Spanish just wiped the floor
Yeah.
because they're in fortified position. So they're like, yeah, they have cannon. So yeah, good luck. Yeah, good luck moving us out.
Supply brigade earlier.
There's another evidence of Japanese trading missions going from Japan in the early 16th, 17th centuries, and actually diplomatic missions going from Japan all the way to Spain. And some of the samurai going between these destinations, just settling down in basically the American Southwest, Mexico, where they serve as missionaries fighting Pueblo Indians, which is also another like little fascinating, like little, yeah. There's another case where the Dutch are fighting over Taiwan with the Chinese government, where they're bringing African mercenaries. So you have in Taiwan, you have African mercenaries fighting against like Chinese troops, and it's like, okay, wild stuff.
Globalization for sure.
Yes, and I want to make it clear, the common theme throughout this is as soon as Europeans come into contact with the Chinese in Asia, they want tea, textiles, and clothing, and porcelain, all the good stuff. As soon as Europeans come into contact with other cultures, all they really want are guns. The number one export in all across European export across all trade routes, guns, gunpowder. Everyone sees guns, gunpowder, like, wow, this is cool stuff. We want more of that, please. Do we need to have Jesus alongside that? Okay, sure, we'll put up with that. It means we have more guns.
Well, thank you.
Thank you very much.